Today, we're going to be talking about limiters and how they control loudness while also preventing our audio from clipping. We're going to discuss some different settings as well as some applied applications in order to make your audio sound louder when uploading it to a streaming service. Hello and welcome to WaveSpot. My name is Austin Knaus and I've been working with audio for over 2 decades. My goal for this channel is to share all the fundamentals that I've learned along the way in hopes to give you a fast track to understanding the world of sound. So, let's dive in. So limiters are just like compressors. And if you don't know what a compressor does, check out this video up here. Limiters are like compressors, but they don't allow audio to pass through them. They actually prevent all audio from passing its threshold, period. So just like a compressor has a threshold, a limiter has a ceiling. So compressors and limiters share some of the same settings like attack and release. So the ones that they have in common, I'm not going to dive too far into because we already discussed how to set those settings up within our episode on compressors. So just like our previous episodes, we're working with this same loop. Limiters are really important because they're our last line of defense when it comes to clipping. What do I mean by that? Well, if I didn't have a limiter on my master chain here, we would actually be clipping. We would be surpassing 0. You can see how our meter is in the red here. If we add a limiter, then it prevents us from actually hitting 0. You can see how it's pinned right up to 0, but it's not actually going into the red. So a limiter limits any audio from passing its threshold, or in other words, its ceiling. To take that a step further, the ceiling is the output level of your limiter. So whatever you set the output dB level is going to be what your ceiling is. So if I set this to -9 dB, it's not going to pass -9 dB. It's going to stay there. So the most common practice when it comes to limiters is adding it to your master chain, but it's the very last effect on the chain. So you put it on your master channel, and it's the last effect that you have in your group, because a limiter is preventing any audio from surpassing its ceiling or its threshold. And if you were to play something after the limiter, it kind of just disregards the fact that you put a limiter in there in the first place. You're going to surpass the ceiling of the threshold. And why we put it at the very end is to keep all of our audio from going above 0 or from clipping. So when it comes to setting up your ceiling or the threshold at which you don't want any audio to pass through, it's most common to set it to -1 or to -2 dB. And I'll explain here in a little bit why we don't actually set it to 0. So just like the compressor, we have our attack time and we have a release time. But because we already discussed those in the compressor lesson, I'm not going to get too far into how to set those up. So if you want to know how, go back to the beginning of this video where I tagged the compression video. Next, we have the look ahead. Now, the look ahead is the amount of time you allow the limiter to look ahead at your audio to see incoming transients or incoming peaks that it's going to have to limit. Now, if you don't give it any look ahead time, it acts more reactive to the audio that you're providing it. If you give it a little bit more, so 3 to 5 milliseconds of look ahead time, it's proactively limiting those peaks. So instead of reacting, it's proactively smoothing out its processes. It's giving you a smoother limiting experience. Next, we'll talk about channel linking. Now, not all limiters have a channel linking setting, but for the ones that do, channel linking is in regards to your left channel and your right channel. Now, when they're 100% linked, it doesn't matter which channel is louder, both channels will be treated equally. Now, when you completely unlink them, then your left channel and your right channel are limited independently. They act as their own individual channels, like almost as if you had two limiters. Now, you might ask, when would you want to link your channels versus unlink your channels? Well, for example, if we were doing vocals or drums or an instrument, feel free to completely unlink the channels, and it allows the stereo image to act independently. So the things that are panned to the left will be limited over on the left and disregard anything that's happening on the right. And vice versa, anything that's happening on the right, it won't limit anything that's on the left, allowing the characteristics of that stereo sound to act independently. Now, when it comes to mastering, limiting on your master channel, we want to link the channels because we want everything to be limited as a whole or as a group. It unifies all of our sounds together. So if you're limiting on individual instruments or individual channels, feel free to use less channel linking. If you are limiting on your master channel, you're going to want to use more linkage. So anywhere from 80% to 100% channel link, so everything is kind of grouped together. So how do we actually use a limiter? How do we apply more limiting? Well, what we would do is we simply increase the gain. What we're doing is we are pushing the gain into the ceiling. So instead of like a compressor where we lower the threshold to meet where the audio is, we are sending the audio up in gain to meet the ceiling. So let's take a look at this example. Let's play the audio as it is. So you can see we have our peaks here of the kick drum. These are already being limited just because they're already louder than our ceiling. This is why it's good practice to keep a limiter set to 0 on your master when you're just simply mixing, because it'll still prevent you from clipping your channels. If we wanted to make the audio louder, we would increase the gain going into the limiter. But at the same time, you have to be careful because if you apply too much limiting, we'll start creating distortion, as you just heard. So let's back this off a little bit and start over. And once we start hearing the distortion, we'll back off a little bit. So right about there, we reduce the amount of distortion we're hearing. So let's increase our look ahead, and let's go with 3 milliseconds, and that should smooth it out a bit. Now that we've smoothed it out a little bit, let's see if we can milk just a little bit more out of the limiter. That sounds about right. So now let's get into LUFS, or loudness units relative to full scale. Now, why is this measurement important? Why is LUFS important? Well, streaming services use LUFS as their primary measurement for loudness. So whenever you upload something to a streaming service, they're going to measure it in LUFS. In fact, Spotify limits your audio to -14 LUFS. YouTube also to -14 LUFS. Amazon limits to -13 LUFS. So 1 LUFS louder than Spotify and YouTube. So now that we know that Spotify and YouTube and Amazon and all the other streaming services actually limit our audio to around -14 LUFS, let's talk about how to optimize our audio for uploading it to a streaming service. One of the most important things when dealing with audio is dynamic range, or dynamics. Now, for example, a real-world example of dynamics is a jump scare in a horror movie. Think about it. As you get closer to the jump scare scene, the audio starts getting quieter and quieter and quieter and quieter. Then all of a sudden it gets really loud and it makes you jump out of your seat because it's jarring. It got quieter before it got way louder. And that difference in audio is dynamics, and it has a visceral emotional response in humans. It gives us the ability to say, that was quiet and this was loud, because without the difference in volume, without the difference in dynamics, we wouldn't have the relative perspective to say this was louder than that, which was quiet. Imagine you were sitting in a library and someone yelled, "Hey," at the top of their lungs. Then you would probably stand up, look around, and try to figure out who yelled "hey," because everybody has been quiet and reading. Now imagine the same situation. You're in a library, but everybody's already yelling. You would almost not even notice the fact that someone yelled "hey." No response, no dynamics, same level. Get the picture? What we're doing when we're limiting is not only are we making our audio louder, we're also limiting the dynamics. We're squeezing the dynamics out of our music. For example, if we reduce this back to 0, we can see all of this dark area. This is our dynamics. That's our dynamic range. The difference between no audio and this kick drum. That is highly dynamic. Now watch what happens when we increase the gain into our limiter. We begin to limit the dynamics. Now, why is this important when it comes to uploading to a streaming service? Well, the preservation of dynamics will actually make your audio seem louder than the audio that was heavily limited prior to uploading. So now let's do a demonstration. We're going to set up 2 different sets of limiters. We're going to have our mastering limiter, and then we're going to reduce it to Spotify's limiter. We're going to do that on the first track, and we're going to do that on the second track. The first track is going to be lightly limited while maintaining its dynamics. The second track is going to be over limited to try and get the most loudness before it hits Spotify. So let's set our first limiter. So we can see that we're already at negative 11.5 LUFS. So I'm not actually going to increase the limiting at all. Now remember, Spotify is still going to turn us down to negative 14. So we're still technically 3 LUFS over Spotify's limiting factor. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our Spotify limiter, and we're going to reduce our volume down to the negative 14 that Spotify would reduce us to. Okay, so here's our Spotify limiter now, and we're roughly around that negative 14 LUFS mark. We're still maintaining quite a lot of our dynamics, and we're not crushing the audio any. So now let's set up our second track, our second set of limiters. This time we're actually going to apply some limiting, which is going to reduce our dynamic range. So let's go back and set this look ahead to 3 milliseconds and see how much limiting we can get out of this limiter. So we got quite a bit of limiting out of this limiter without getting too much distortion. And as you can see now, we're at negative 8.4 LUFS. So Spotify is going to turn us down to that negative 14 LUFS mark. So let's go ahead and do that. So there we have it. Here's our Spotify limiter. So this is roughly the level that Spotify is going to turn us down to. And as you can see, we're peaking at negative 8 dB. Let's go look at our non-limited or our non-squeezed limiter. What does that look like? So you can see here that this track is actually peaking at negative 3 dB. So after Spotify turned it down, it's still technically 5 dB louder than the original track that we limited heavily. And not only is it perceivably louder, it's actually more dynamic, which means we still have more to squeeze out of it. Now, why is that important? Not only is your song going to be louder, it's going to have more dynamics when you upload it to a streaming service. And after that, if we go and play that in a car or at a concert or in a hi-fi system or a house stereo, those actually have limiters on them as well to prevent any damage to your speakers. So let's say we were at a concert and we were going to play these songs. The song that has more dynamics to begin with is going to be able to be pushed further than the song that has less dynamics. What do I mean by that? Well, let's add yet another limiter to each one of these. So if you remember, the track that we didn't limit heavily was around negative 11.5 LUFS. And then Spotify went and turned it down to negative 14. So now we're left here. So this is our track after Spotify has reduced the level. Now, imagining that we're at a concert with a limiter before it hits the speakers, watch how much more we can push this track. Starting to get a little distortion, so let's add some look ahead. So now this track that was originally at negative 11.5 and then reduced to negative 14 is now sitting at negative 8.9 LUFS. It's actually louder than the original track post uploading it to Spotify and then replaying it out into a loudspeaker system at a concert. And it still has its dynamics. Now let's look at the second track that had applied limiting, then uploaded to Spotify, which was turned down, and now we're going to play it out of a loudspeaker system at a concert that has a limiter before the speakers. Again, let's turn this up and see what we can get out of it. So you can see that we're at negative 7.6 when we were originally at around negative 0.8 before we uploaded it to Spotify. So in the long run, we actually only gained 1 LUFS, whereas compared to our other track gained 3 LUFS. Now, the difference here is that the first track that gained 3 LUFS in the long run is actually still fairly dynamic. This track, however, almost has no dynamics at all. So our first track that started off at negative 11.5 LUFS and then uploaded to Spotify, which turned it down to negative 14 LUFS, at a concert could be pushed to negative 8.8 LUFS. That's a whole extra 3 LUFS louder than our original upload. And it still maintains its dynamics, which is what the listener experiences as engagement. It's engaging. Our listener can hear the difference between the louder parts and the quieter parts. It's not just noise. Whereas our second track is technically only 1 LUFS louder than the original upload. The difference, though, is that this doesn't have dynamic range anymore. It's flat. And no dynamics means no groove. It takes all of the impact away from the listener. So again, if you were in a library where everybody was being quiet, and then all of a sudden somebody yelled, "Hey," at the top of their lungs, everybody would get up and turn around and try to figure out who yelled, "Hey." Whereas the opposite, if everybody was already yelling and somebody in the distance yelled, "Hey," nobody would bat an eye because nobody would know any different because the volume level didn't drastically change. The dynamics were flatlined. And that's the difference between over-limiting a track before you upload it to a streaming service and keeping a healthy amount of dynamics before you upload to a streaming service. So we set our limiters ceiling to -1 to -2 to allow a 1 to 2 dB buffer before 0. This 100% guarantees no audio will ever hit 0 dB and actually clip. The only clipping we're going to get is the distortion from actually over-limiting our audio. Music's true impact comes from dynamic range. Limiting our music's dynamic range too much before we upload it to a streaming service is actually going to make our music sound quieter than the music that has a wider dynamic range before it gets uploaded to the same streaming service. Having more dynamic range before uploading to a streaming service is also going to allow us to listen to that music at a louder level. So if we were to go to a concert, the larger dynamic range song is going to be able to be limited more than the song that had more limiting prior to uploading to that streaming service. If you got any value out of today's episode, leave a like and hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. If you learned something new, or if you still have a question, leave a comment below and I'd be more than happy to get back to you and give you an answer. If you want to read more on the topic, head over to wavespot.com where I have much more detailed information along with all of the illustrations from today's episode written in a blog post. And until next time, thanks for watching.